And here I'm relying on the work of a great Dominican scholar called Servet Pinckaers. Died just a short time ago, was a professor at Freiburg in Switzerland. Pinckaers distinguishes two types of freedom. The first he calls the freedom of indifference. The second, freedom for excellence. And everything will hinge upon this distinction. What's the freedom of indifference? The view of freedom that comes up from Scotus and Occam in the late Middle Ages and then very much informs the modern philosophers I've been describing. Here's the freedom of indifference. Freedom means, liberty means, to stand above the yes and no, indifferent to the two, and on the basis of no compulsion, interior or exterior, to decide. Do I come to Duke to give this talk, or do I stay home? I hover above the yes and no, and then I freely decide, without any compulsion. That's freedom. It's autonomous self-direction. Now again, think of the moderns, including Thomas Jefferson, and the people that inspired our culture, are very strong precisely on this autonomous sense of freedom. Now, on that reading, what's the threat to freedom? Anything heteronymous. Now again, think of Kant here. Anything heteronymous. Other people, societies, churches, laws, ultimately, God, the supreme threat to my capacity to determine the meaning of my life. Did you ever read the 1992 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in the matter of Casey versus Planned Parenthood? It was an abortion-related case, but what's really breathtaking is the way the justices expressed their judgment. Here's part of it. It belongs to the very nature of liberty to determine the meaning of one's own life, of nature, of the universe, and of existence. Oh, is that all? That's all I get to decide. You see how breathtaking that is? It's this, if you want, freedom of indifference run amok. Now, Pinckaers contrasts that to another view of freedom, which is on display not only in the classical medieval philosophers, but also very much in the Bible. This he calls freedom for excellence. Here's what he means. On this reading, freedom is not primarily autonomy. Freedom is rather a disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. I'll say that formula again, then I'll give you examples. True freedom, freedom for excellence, is the disciplining of desire so as to make the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. So, I stand before you now as a relatively free speaker of English. I can say pretty much whatever I want to say in English. When I was studying French many years ago, when I was over in Paris and trying to learn the language, and anyone that's wrestled with a second or third language knows what I'm talking about. What I felt above all was unfree. I'm in a seminar room in Paris with all sorts of, smart, articulate francophones, and there I was, knowing what I wanted to say with all the proper nuances, but I couldn't say it. Right? I was shackled by my incapacity to speak French. Over time, after submitting to a whole set of disciplines and laws, grammar, syntax, vocabulary, the correction of speakers, etc., I became freer in my speaking. On this reading, freedom is not opposed to law. See how I'm driving at? But rather, freedom is a consequence of law. Law which disciplines the desire so as to achieve the good and then make it effortless. Think of someone that plays a musical instrument. We all know that if we struggle to play the piano or guitar or something. In the beginning, you're unfree. But then it's not by autonomous choice that you become free. It's by submitting yourself to a whole set of disciplines, practices, examples, correction, etc., that you become free. Any golfers? This is golf country out here, right? I'm a golfer and a very poor one, I would say. What clearly doesn't work when it comes to golf? take the club and swing any way you want. Just get out there and be yourself. Well, I can guarantee you'll be a lousy golfer. In fact, I have it with me on this trip. Whenever I travel, my favorite magazine is Golf Digest. If you know Golf Digest, it has stories about, golfers and so on. But at the heart of it is a little section that has all these illustrations and instructions of how to stand and your head and your elbow and shoulder and the turn. And I'll find myself reading this magazine mulling over the law. Because the law there is placing in my body and my mind what makes me free to play the game. Who's the freest golfer? Not anymore, he's got the yips, I think, but Tiger Woods, at the height of his powers, was the freest golfer ever to play. Hit drives, sure, hit a 3-wood, hit out of fairway bunkers, hit out of greenside bunkers, putt, chip, pitch. He could do it all. Now, why? Because he just swung the club any way he wanted? No, because his freedom, his desire had become disciplined by a whole set of laws that made the achievement of the good first possible and then effortless. Now, can I suggest, everybody, the monothelite controversy that insists upon the two wills in Jesus coming together, an infinite freedom and a finite freedom, in a non-competitive way, so that the finite human freedom of Jesus is, like the burning bush, enhanced and brought to perfection precisely by contact with infinite freedom. That doesn't make any sense on the first reading of freedom, does it? If freedom means autonomy, I decide. But it makes eminent sense on the second reading of freedom. Think here of Paul. Paul, who introduces himself often in his letters as the doulos Christou Jesu. I'm the slave of Christ Jesus. But then Paul can say, that same Paul can say, it's for freedom that Christ has set me free. Well, that makes no sense on the first reading of freedom. If you're anybody's slave, you're not free. On the second reading, it makes perfect sense. The more you're enslaved to Christ, the freer you are.